The next speaker on day 5 of our conference, where we are looking at the future of sustainability, is a young researcher, Graaf, and she will be looking at people, power, and the environment. Now, Caitlin is a researcher and consultant in alternative development strategies for socio-economic equity in southern African protected areas using the political ecology approach. Her work examines the issues of power, especially as they relate to education, to skills, development, tourism, and rural communities. She's presently a subject matter expert in social economic development and community development, as well as strategy and engagement at the award-winning Imagine Scholar. Caitlin explains in her talk that political ecology is a tool that can be used with various disciplines to examine the impact that people have on the environment and how it can be used to examine systemic and sustainability issues. For example, she looks at game parks and how this influences the lives of people and the environment. Hi, Caitlin. Welcome to the Inspired Conference, and we're really, really blessed to have you here to talk to our audience about a topic that they might not know that much about, and that is political ecology. Great to have you here and for you to share your knowledge with us.
Hi, Ellery. Thank you so much for having me. I am super excited to talk about this topic. I think it's such a useful and as you say, not very well known, I think, in mainstream conversations about sustainability topic. So yeah, excited to dive in. Thank you so much for bringing me in.
Thank you so much. Since we now, we've started looking, or we just mentioned the fact that people don't necessarily understand or know that much about political ecology, maybe you can share with us a little bit about the origin of it and what this generally is about.
Sure. So I think it's useful to acknowledge, I think, that political ecology as a field kind of came onto the scene really in about the 1970s is when we started to see political ecology emerge. And it started to, I think, really be born out of a number of different fields: anthropology, sociology, environmentalism, ecology, at really looking at human behavior as it relates to the environment. So the ecology side of it, to me, is almost a little bit of a misnomer. As soon as you hear ecology, you immediately want to think physical sciences, natural processes, etc. Political ecology is very much a social science. It's really looking at humanizing environmental issues and environmental management. And from a use perspective, it becomes very, very useful, I think, to start to probe some of these issues, particularly of poverty and inequality as they relate to environmentalism and access to natural resources. So we'll start to see political ecologists and people that use this kind of analytical lens looking at environmental issues and human issues and environments, looking at the historical legacies though. So it's very much focused on history and histories of oppression and colonialism, histories of power. It's very geographically focused, so you'll have these localized view of issues. And finally, political ecology will really look at problems through multiple different scales. So you'll look at issues at a local lens, at the individual level, to the community level, all the way up to national and international levels.
And it's very interesting to see how things evolve and how new centers of attention, new directions of study opens up. Now, traditionally, you wouldn't think of ecology in a political, you wouldn't see its ecology and politics together, because ecology is usually apolitical. So why was it necessary to bring these two elements together?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think this is really a sort of fundamental piece of why political ecology is so important. There's a lovely quote that I'm just going to read from a book about political ecology that is one of my favorites, naturally.
Right.
It says, I've just got it here, it says, if our ecological relationships are unsustainable, so are the social relationships that produce them. I think the kind of a golden thread here is that, you know, environments are inherently political and are really they're constructed out of the human imagination, really. If you think of any kind of environment, whether it is, you know, anything from a national park to an ocean to an urban center to your back garden, it's something that people have created. Someone has created those boundaries, whether they're physical boundaries or metaphorical boundaries. And a really important piece of that is that people who hold power get to make those boundaries. They get to define those boundaries. So political ecology then becomes a tool to say, who are those people in power? Why do they make those boundaries? How do they make those boundaries? Who does that exclude? And how do we produce and define what are really human environments? And, you know, I think this can happen as soon as you lift the lid on this sort of politicization of nature. You see it happening everywhere. It's almost quite kind of ubiquitous. You know, you've got things like the Dakota Access Pipeline running through indigenous lands in the US. You have a lot of issues with the privatization of common land, publicly accessible land. This has happened a lot in the UK. Displacement of people to create national parks. As you and I both know, this happens a lot in Africa. You know, there's so many instances of environments being produced and created in a political sense that have very large impacts on human lives. So I think, to answer your question, it is extremely important when we think about natural resource management and environmentalism and environmental sustainability, to politicize those issues and look at those underlying structures that define them.
It's maybe even utopian to think you can talk about the environment without the political side of it, right? It just doesn't exist in an idealistic bubble up somewhere, because there are humans involved, and when humans are involved, politics are involved. Now, what would you say to critics who say that, but this is unscientific? You can't link these two together because, you know, we can't politicize environmental phenomena. What do you think about that?
It's an interesting question. I think this is definitely a debate that we see. I mean, if you Google political ecology, you will see these kind of debates, especially coming from the hard science side. There's a little bit of that pushback. Ultimately, the social sciences will always be critiqued for being unscientific. I think
that's true.
This is just the world we live in, and the social sciences will always get that critique, and that's okay. Ultimately, I think the debate exists for the validity and the importance of the fields. I don't think the debate is that important. As I said, I think the social sciences will always be critiqued for being unscientific, but for me, political ecology and ecology are two completely different fields in how they conceptualize and analyze problems. And instead of political ecology is not trying to monopolize real estate in ecology is academia. It is a completely separate field. So, you know, where an ecologist might be able to kind of unearth scientific processes that are really, really important, like with climate change, for example, we need to know the science of climate change to understand how to fix it. But understanding the science of climate change hasn't fixed the problem. Yes. And I think the important thing to grasp here is that physical sciences won't necessarily influence human behavior, and the production of these environmental issues is very much rooted in human behavior and our narratives of consumption and production, the kind of deep human want to wear blazer to a conference, those very fundamental social constructions that we all live within, those are really the drivers of how we produce and consume and contribute ultimately to climate change. So we need both sets of tools, the scientific tool and the tool that looks at human nature, human experience, social sciences, and they need to work together.
That's a great explanation, because basically what you're saying is there's the what and the why,
Yeah.
The science of it, but looking at why these things are happening, and understanding the what is not going to necessarily make us change our behaviors. So
Exactly.
now, as I understand from political economy, that ecology, there are three factors that are usually discussed. You're looking at political, social, and economic factors. So this covers a wide range of possibilities, right? So
Yeah.
what unites this for you, you're a political ecologist? What brings this together? What are the key characteristics that would unite people, political ecologists like yourself?
Yeah, so it's a really diverse field, and I think also worth noting that fundamental to the definition of political ecology is it's borrowed from the term political economy, which you almost said, and I've misspoken more times than I can count now. It's a binding together of political economy, which I think has been really just a more accepted version of political economy. There we go, ecology. Politicizing economic issues and moving beyond just the mathematical models of economics and looking at economics as a social issue. So it borrows that style of thinking and applies it to environmental management. But likewise, political economy is a very diverse field, like is political ecology, that questions, who fundamentally has power, what do they do with it, what do they own, what do they have access to, who is excluded. And because of those sort of roots, as you say, it is a very diverse field that is often applied to things like livelihoods, wealth, poverty, inequality. I think a useful way to look at political ecology for me is to think of it not as someone you are. So instead of saying I'm a political ecologist, to saying, flipping it around a little bit and saying political ecology is something that I do or a tool that I use. I think positioning it as a framework or an analytical lens to drive inquiry that's a little bit more motivated by power and social structures becomes a little bit more of a useful application. Then anyone can use it. You can be an economist or an anthropologist or a geographer like me. You can be an ecologist who wants to look at some of the more human side of things. And then it becomes a tool and a framework that is really widely accessible to anyone who wants to kind of grapple with these big, complex problems in a way that unearths a little bit more nuance maybe than we were able to before.
That's maybe very good advice, not only for this particular field, but for studies in general, because we tend to wear the cloak and say this is who I am, and that prevents you from looking broader and looking at other points of view or other approaches to looking at the world. That's something that I think it's a good message for people out there to consider using that as a framework. Now, would you say that this study is a response of society towards the way we've been treating the environment, that we could maybe understand how to be more sustainable from an ideological standpoint?
Yeah, for sure. I do think so. I imagine that political ecology as an academic field, but also political ecology in the sense that, I think there's a lot of research and thinking that is of a political ecology nature, but isn't named political ecology. I do think that's seen quite a steep increase as we start to realize that, you know, we as people are, that we have a lot of power to shape our environments and nature, and likewise that, you know, climate change is catching up with us. And I think people are starting to realize that we are very much dependent on our living planet, which is a bit of a both a scary, an obvious and a scary, you know, realization. So I think this style of thinking has become much more popularized as people become more fluent with sustainability issues and environmental issues in general. But also, I think it's important to differentiate a little bit between some of the different sustainability ideologies and how we can use these different ideologies in different capacities. So for me, political ecology is very much about nuance and complexity. If you compare that, for example, to something like the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, that have been, you know, I think something that should be celebrated about the SDGs are that they have been so phenomenally and impressively universally accepted. And for a sustainability agenda to reach that level of global acknowledgement and acceptance is a really big deal. And I think the reason why they've been able to be so widely accepted is because they're broad. Yeah. The SDGs, the intention behind the SDGs is not to be a mandate for every country down to the T. It's supposed to be this kind of big, little bit loose scaffolding that each country can then go and personalize and customize at the national level, at the regional level, at the local level. So once you have this big scaffolding, which we do now, political ecology then becomes a tool, I think, to kind of slot in at that next layer of customization, and really a useful tool to say, okay, now we kind of know these big areas that we need to impact, or we need to improve, or we need to be mindful of. Now we've got a tool that can really interrogate those issues of power in my context, again, being mindful of the history of my area, my exact geography, where am I, how does that influence sustainability issues, and again, across different scales from hyperlocal to the national level. What can I learn from that type of inquiry, and how does that change the sustainability conversation for me where I am?
And as you mentioned, it's so important in the localization element for it to have real meaning for the people who are involved.
Yeah.
You can't just have these you can have a broad general framework, but to make a real change, you need to go down and get people involved. And that is, maybe you can give a few examples of how political ecology has been used or in practice to improve the environment. That would be quite interesting, I think, for us to listen to that.
Absolutely. So there's, of course, again, there's so many different ways in which political ecology can be used, and I think it can be applied to so many different problems. But kind of a common issue, I'll share maybe a few examples that would be kind of quintessential applications of political ecology. So thinking of, this is one that I think is particularly important, thinking of environmental externalities. So who bears the brunt of corporate pollution? This is such a big conversation now with climate change, and as the impact of business and businesses are under such scrutiny to improve their environmental impacts. Big agriculture is such a common one to pick on. But a very common problem with big ag is that a lot of the fertilizers that are used, so for example, nitrogen and phosphorus, those nutrients essentially will leach into the soils and quite literally have downstream effects. So the pollutants will go into the soil and then into the waterways. And one very common problem we see is a phenomena called eutrophication, which is where these nutrients seep into the waterways, create these algal blooms in the waterways, and completely choke out marine ecosystems. Yeah, it's quite a, I think if you're not in environmental studies, it's like, oh, that's really creepy and really scary, and but it is such a prevalent issue. So an ecologist might look at that and say, okay, what is the environmental impact of big agriculture and eutrophication? How is it resulting in biodiversity loss? How is this disrupting ecosystems, etc.? A political ecologist might come into that picture and say, are there communities that literally live downstream from these big farms who will have their livelihoods impacted? Does it disrupt recreational zones? Is this pollution making marginalized members of society more vulnerable? Those are the kinds of questions a political ecologist would ask. Likewise, I think when we think about the climate crisis and north-south relationships, the climate crisis, I think we all know that the countries in the north that have a rather high level of wealth and consumption are really responsible for the vast majority of greenhouse gas emissions and climate change, whereas you see the people that are really bearing the brunt of climate change and severe weather might be a smallholder farmer in Malawi, or pastoralists in Kenya who are now struggling to water their cattle. So political ecology is starting to kind of look at these power dynamics, again, across many different scales, internationally or locally, to really to kind of sort out those structures that drive environmental change. One other just very quick and very quintessential example would be, and this is what got me interested in political ecology initially, is looking at poaching in Africa. I think.
Yes,
Yeah.
South African, that's very close to my heart. So yeah, that would be very interesting to hear how that is, how you view that.
Absolutely. So I think it's, a lot of the stories and the narratives that were told about poaching is that poaching is bad, obviously, right? This is the common notion that we all have. But what political ecology is going to come in and do is really look at the human issues and the real causes and drivers of these crucial ecological issues that are resulting in extreme biodiversity loss in Africa, for example. So instead of saying poaching is really bad and we need to arm rangers, maybe we do need to do this, but we'll look at the upstream effects and say, okay, maybe what we have here is what has been historically very exclusionist conservation regimes. So you have a lot of people being displaced from what were quite rural areas to put up fences, to put up parks that are then monetized through tourism. So certain people are displaced so that other people can visit. It creates a little bit of a weird power dynamic. And then you have really the key economic beneficiaries of conservation being property owners, business owners. Meanwhile, you have many, many, many people living on the fringes of these conservation areas with little access to education, little access to quality work, probably living in poverty, little access to social services. Someone comes along and says, I'll pay you a year's worth of wages to hunt a rhino. And you're thinking, okay, I can feed my kids then. Of course you're going to poach. Of course it happens. So it's a very different line of inquiry, but it starts to say, you know, what are really the driving factors? And maybe even on the other side, I'll say, you know, what are the driving social and cultural factors that create demand for rhino horn and other parts of the world? Why do people want to buy it in the first place? And how might we be able to start to chip away at that ultimate demand, and then those really key parts of the supply chain?
What you're basically saying is that you need a multi-dimensional approach in solving these issues. And
Yeah.
by arming rangers, you're not going to solve the problem. You might, you know, put out a little fire on this corner, but it would break out somewhere else. So
Yeah.
what it's offering is a more long-lasting, sustainable solution, because
Exactly.
you are looking much more broadly at all those causes. And I can mention, living in Malaysia, that we faced the annual haze, which is a result of the forest fires, which is,
Oh, wow.
caused by so many of the same, factors that you're mentioning. The whole debate around palm oil, the whole debate
Yeah.
around sustainable living, and people that are told, don't clear the land, but there's no other economic solution for them. And again, who
Right.
demands the palm oil? And you've got the ecologists looking at what this is doing to the forests and to the orangutan populations. I mean, it's just very complex, and there isn't just
Yeah.
one answer. So what you're
Yeah.
describing is so necessary, to bring people together and work in a cross dimensional, cross disciplinary, have a cross disciplinary approach.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, when the environment, often when the environment is mistreated, you can go back and say, well, the government has their own agenda. It could be oil drilling, or, well, I mean, like in the case with, I don't want to mention a particular government, but, with deforestation, plant, palm oil. So
There's probably many governments you could mention.
yeah, I think if we drill down, right?
Yeah.
So poverty is such an ingrained characteristic in society. How can we change this or evolve it into something more sustainable?
Yeah. Just to respond to something that you said earlier that really resonated with me, I think, yeah, what you said was so spot on. Complex problems need sophisticated tools. We have to have sophisticated tools that treat the causes, not the symptoms.
Yes.
I think that's, if I can give a good solid plug for political ecology in this talk, I would like that to be it. Complex problems need sophisticated tools, and this is, I think, the kind of tool that drills down into those multidimensional aspects, as you mentioned, and hopefully will be nuanced enough to start to address these complex causes, not their symptoms.
It makes a lot of sense, doesn't it, Caitlin? I mean,
It does.
You have your traditional disciplines, and you go to university, and there's all these departments and people specializing in these old disciplines, but life has changed so much and it's become so much more complex. So it's absolutely logical that the field of study should evolve, and that the ivory towers that often exist in academic study should be broken down, because you cannot just find the solutions by just drilling down deep. You need to drill down deep, but you need to connect widely. And I still, this is just my personal view, but I don't think enough of that is happening in the world of academia, and in trying to find solutions. And that's actually part of what we were trying to do with the Inspired Conference, is to say, well, future from through 5 different lenses, and there are many more lenses, but we couldn't get to all of them. But that really makes a lot of sense, and I think we should use that quote of yours extensively. It's really great. So to come back to the question, though, how, of governments and politics and profit, how do we turn this around?
Hard question. I wish I had a perfect answer to it. Yeah, I think there's such a debate right now that sits, I think, in a number of different fields, from economics to development studies to sustainability as well. Again, those three things really finding a nexus in this question. There's an argument, I think, over whether it's possible to have sustained and exponential economic growth on a finite planet. No one has the answer to this question, but we certainly like debating about it, that's for sure. It's a very important debate to have. So one side of this argument is going to say that it is impossible to decouple economic growth, sustained economic growth, from the consumption of finite and non-renewable natural resources. So this style of thinking is what's called degrowth into steady state economics. So basically what this is saying is that countries, instead of pursuing endless GDP growth, that they need to let go of GDP as the metric of human and national success, and dematerialize their economies, so allow for a reduction in GDP to what would hopefully be globally sustainable levels of consumption and production. I think that idea is still very radical.
Yeah, I wanted to say.
Still feels like, oh, it's scary. The other side of the coin is going to be this idea that it is possible to sufficiently decouple economic growth from natural resource consumption, because we're swapping to a knowledge economy, and really that human innovation will invent a way out of the problem. So this is sort of the mantra of what's called green growth. Yeah, there's, as I mentioned, there's the debate is far more nuanced than that, but I think those two trajectories, speaking in the context of sustainability, understanding that some people are, would sit further on the other side and maybe not be interested in environmental sustainability that much at all. But there are some really interesting thinkers who are working on this right now. I would definitely encourage anyone who's viewing the conference to check out Kate Raworth. She's a British economist. She had a very popular TED Talk a little while ago, and she released a book called Donut Economics, basically saying that people must live above a floor of social justice and below an ecological ceiling. So basically we need to solve some of these pressing social issues while realizing that we live on a finite planet. She aligns with the school of thought that says green growth is probably not possible. So she herself, as an economist, is agnostic towards growth. She says that growth is a necessary stage in the life cycle of an economy, and then we should mature into a state of, again, steady state economics with a flat line of GDP. And she suggests thinking of the circular economy as sort of an alternative pathway forward.
That's what we can do is we can actually share with the audience a link to her book and her TED Talk.
Yeah, that would be great.
And it would be great to have her to comment and get into our It's Space community group, so let's see if we can get her to comment and participate in the conversation. So what is this, can you expand a little bit more on, the concept of the circular economy, which has become so sort of cool and
it is very trendy. So circular economy it's really a new model, I suppose, for production and consumption that is really intended to follow nature's laws. So it says that waste from some ecological process should become food for the next ecological process. So if you just swap the word ecological with industrial, there you have circular economy in its essence. So the goal is really to design out waste. So you're using all of your waste and to retain and recycle nutrients, or in our case, value, some kind of societal value, whether that's monetary or not. Yeah, and I mean, as you said, circular economy thinking, I think right now is very cool. There's a lot of very trendy. There's a lot of little pockets of innovation happening here. There's a lot of particularly small kind of millennial companies who have come onto the scene doing interesting things in this space, particularly in the fashion industry.
Yes.
You've seen a lot of companies tap into this, idea of send us your used clothing or your gently used shoes, and we will either repurpose the materials, make them into something else new entirely, or resell them so that those materials stay in use, stay in the system instead of ending up in a landfill.
Yeah.
But I think on a global scale, it's easy for a small company to make those changes. On a big scale, and if you look at the critical mass of products that are out there, this style of thinking has not been mainstreamed yet, and it's a big push, and it would require big, complex companies completely changing their models of production and how they make a profit. And we're still in this stage very much of produce, use, throw away. And changing that model to become a circular regenerative model, I think on a grand scale is actually quite tricky.
And it's almost, I mean, if you go to the whole concept of looking at political ecology, when you look at this, you also can't just think, or maybe it's very idealistic, or as you said, it's maybe possible to achieve in a very small environment or within an environment that's in your control. But I mean, you need to examine all the other factors that are involved. As you mentioned, there's very large scale factors involved here that would need to change, or that needs to be examined. The psyche of people. Why are we so consumerist? Why do we need to constantly change and buy new clothes and buy new things? What is fueling our desire? Is it then look at maybe the advertising and marketing industry, look at the producers, the factories, the people that ultimately make the profit out of this, all of this, and will people lose their jobs if you start changing this? What's the impact? So yes, it is a good ideal, the whole idea of reusing and not wasting and conserving. Do you think that this is an agenda that we should push further? Do you think it's something that we should put more? You've mentioned that it hasn't really got that much traction. Is it worth putting more attention into this?
Yes, I think we have to. I guess, unless maybe the nihilistic of us would say, oh well, any kind of optimism.
God, I'm going shopping.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, no, I do think it's essential. Yeah, like I've said before, I think we've maybe lacked the appropriate tools to get this job done, and I want to be careful also saying that political ecology is some kind of panacea to the world's environmental problems. It's a tool. It's a toolkit. It's an important toolkit, but it's a vehicle for inquiry, essentially. But I think it's so useful in these kinds of conversations because power is so central to these difficult ecological problems and human problems. So in the context of mass scale shifts in business models towards the circular economy, there's the status quo, how it is now, benefits the people in power. It makes people who own businesses who are responsible for gross levels of pollution and environmental degradation really, really rich. So, the distribution, a really important point of political ecology is to say that the distribution of benefits from nature is highly unequal throughout our international society, and the negative impacts of environmental degradation are highly unequal between members of our society. So you often have people with the smallest amount of power really bearing the brunt of this global environmental climate crisis, versus the people who probably have the most power to change it really being the safest from it.
And maybe
So
they sometimes think we're so removed from nature, we're so removed from feeling the impact. We live in cities, we live in safe, comfortable environments. So how much does it really affect us? And I've been wondering about the impacts of this coronavirus and people being self-isolating and not allowed to leave their homes for months. I wonder if this is going to change people's mindsets, where suddenly you realize, well, hey, I've gone for 3 months without buying more clothes, or I'm beginning to see what nature can do and what can happen to us. And I hope that does something to sort of the collective consciousness, but maybe it's the utopian or the optimistic view that I have of the world. But, it could perhaps have some kind of an impact.
Yeah, I hope so. I think you can't solve a problem you don't understand, and you won't solve a problem you don't care about.
Yes.
So I think both of those things need to change. Hopefully this political ecology can be a tool to help understand those fundamental power dynamics that I think sit very core to these environmental problems and incentives to change. But exactly as you say, there has to be some kind of movement in the needle of collective caring about environmental crisis. And I think actually that has started to move a little bit. Of course, there's people at every end of the spectrum, but I don't know, I hope that collectively we are starting to realize that we are very, very dependent on our on our very fragile system.
Just look at this. Just look at what's happening. So if you can just remain apathetic and think, oh, well, this, because suddenly it's not happening to people in some other country that I never have to know about. I buy my milk and it comes out of a carton, and that's as far as it goes for me. But suddenly it transcends those borders. It comes into your home, and
becomes very real.
You have to start looking at, well, what are the real causes here, and how does this unite us as human beings? But I wondered, what can locals do? Do you think that, we spoke about the difficulty and companies to take action and how difficult it is and these big models that need to change. But do you think locals have the power to change it or have an influence?
yes and no. I think this is a tricky one. I think often people, I think this is going to be something that I echo a lot through this talk, is that the people with the least agency to change the problems are likely going to be the people who are most affected by them. And I think no matter what problem you're looking at in society, whether that is, you know, poverty, health problems, environmental issues, sort of disenfranchisement makes it harder to solve the problem autonomously in a way, if that makes sense. So I think there's different layers of this. At the same time, or on the other hand, I think it's really important that people are civically engaged. I mean, it sounds very simplistic, but vote, you know, vote for people, for politicians with robust environmental agendas, vote with your wallet, go and support those small companies that have transitioned to the circular economy. I think collectively as consumers, or at least those layers of society that, you know, are in a position, sort of the middle class, in a position to consume, and to have some kind of elasticity in terms of what we buy, that we can go and buy a more expensive product because it is environmentally sustainable. Do it, you know, put some pressure on companies to say, you know, this is where my demand is going. And I think there's been a lot of really positive movement on that side. Also supporting NGOs that do good work. I think there's always going to be a bit of quibbling about the efficacy of any organization. Every organization will always be scrutinized in some capacity, and they should be. We should be critical of big institutions. But NGOs have proven that they can make changes when policy is lacking, or, you know, civic action is lacking. They do have the capacity to make some changes. So I think getting involved with those organizations is definitely a good step. But also, I think important to this conversation is that I do feel that the poor, I don't particularly like that term, but the poor are often blamed for environmental degradation. You know, there's this kind of, I think, insidious idea of saying, you know, poor people create a lot of plastic waste because of single-use plastics, or they are burning biofuels, you know, a whole myriad of issues. But, you know, we do exist in the society where environmentally sustainable products, or products with a long life cycle, are in some ways a luxury. And that's a very difficult part, I think, of the design of our economic system in terms of how we think about sustainability, that is sort of at odds, where it is environmentally expensive to be poor. And how do we change that? I'm not an economist, nor do I have the answer to that question, but I think it's something that really needs to be solved. And also noting that those cheap products are not reflective of the true cost of that product from the moment that it's produced to the time that it's disposed of. The cost of dealing with that waste is not reflected in the product. And if it were, it would probably be out of reach to the world's poor as well. And where does that leave people? I think there's very, very tricky economic questions embedded in this issue too.
But it feels also, as you're talking, and as an educationalist, you know, for me, you know, the little lights just keep on going off, because education plays such an important role. And when you talk about prices of products, you know, living or trying to reduce, trying to live a lifestyle that is green, looking at organic products, looking at, I mean, it's not always cheap. It's much more expensive, but as you also said, that the real cost of a cheap product is not the real cost. And if people
Yeah.
can start thinking about that, well, you might pay more for this environmentally free product, but the actual cost is lower than
Yeah.
choosing the cheaper alternative. And that is where I think on a broader scale, communities can be informed and educated in schools, and to really start looking at deeper and under the surface, so the next time when you weigh up this product, versus this one, ask yourself, what is the cost to the economy? What's the cost to clean up the sea, the oceans? What's the cost
Yeah.
of products seeping into the water and into the soil? And that is a question of, I really believe, of education, of discussion and broader discussion. Um,
Yeah.
so, and do you think that, coming from, when we look at Africa and let's take the examples of the nature reserves and people living on the fringes. I have seen examples of when you involve the local communities in understanding what the benefits are of protecting the environment, and you actually involve them in the process, that it becomes a much more sustainable long-term endeavor than so that they can play a role when there is better understanding and better support, maybe also
Yeah.
for them in this.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really, really good point. There's been a very interesting shift, I think, in development theory and development thinking in general. Kind of starting around the early 2000s, we started to see the shift towards community-based models. And what that means is really a shift in governance over some kind of resource. So in our case, natural resources. And there are a whole slew of community-based blanks. So community-based tourism, community-based conservation, there's community-based natural resource management, there's all sorts of community-based things now. And the crux of all of them is saying that we are trying to democratize power. Again, going back to this very core concept of power, instead of having these often Western-dominated models of conservation or resource use, that communities who have likely lived in these environments for years and years and years and many generations are regaining a bit of that agency and control to manage the natural resources that they have been managing for many years. And I think there's a little bit of a paradigm shift. There's in environmentalism, environmental ethics, there's this concept of romanticized wilderness. And it's a very sort of US style of environmental management. It was really pioneered in Yosemite National Park. Again, that kind of fortress style conservation where people are removed from a natural area to protect it and almost to create somewhat of a fictitious, pristine wilderness free of human influence, when it never was that, but that's been artificially created. That style of thinking was then transplanted into Africa. And now we're starting to see, not completely, but a little bit of that being pulled back on and replaced by these community-based models where people who have previously been a little bit disenfranchised by the conservation agenda are now being much more included. And as a result of that, there's many successes and there's many failures as well in community-based models for various reasons. But a positive output of that, beyond just the inherent value of democratization, is that we start to see people really being able to generate wealth, whether that's monetary wealth, some kind of selling natural assets, crops, but also non-monetary wealth, owning land, using land, subsistence farming, hunting within ecological boundaries. So yeah, it's a really, really good point, and another ideology or another tool essentially to move this sustainability agenda forward, and hopefully a little bit more of an equitable way.
And as you were talking about it, and as you've explained what political ecology does, I think that creates also a really good, interesting model, or examples of change to be studied by political ecologists. What makes
Yeah.
it fail and what makes it work, and what are the factors, and is it because of local circumstance? Is it because of the model? Is it that it's really, really interesting. What about the green, whole green movement? I know you said, we don't like to use the word, but the green movement can sometimes be seen as a very elitist or exclusive movement. So how can this whole approach really, what can we learn about the green movement?
Yeah. It's tricky. Again, I think ultimately, political ecology is getting at the sort of core social processes that sit behind environmental degradation. So beyond what we've mentioned before, looking at the true cost of products and sort of the inequality that's produced in terms of purchasing power and being able to live sustainably, I think the value of political ecology in this green movement is to understand the distribution of power to different people and how that influences the efficacy of the green movement. I think again, like I said earlier, you can't fix a problem you don't understand. So I think we need to be much more aware, and there's very little, I think, actually theorization on how different people understand sustainability, what it means, and how it's internalized, how it's understood. Some people, again, looking at those different conceptualizations of environmentalism and environmental ethics, some people see sustainability as the environment's holding intrinsic value. The environments and nature should be allowed to proliferate because it's important outside of people. Other people have an instrumental value of nature. They think that we need our global system to be sustainable so that people can actually continue to live here. There's so many different ways of skinning the cat, really. And I think looking at all of these different understandings of sustainability, we need to have a tool that unearths these different opinions, because you can't mainstream something that you haven't had diverse voices contributing to. It doesn't.
That's a core element, right? And I mean,
yeah,
as you were talking about these different interpretations, and I mean, I've seen this myself in so many aspects. If you ask the general public, people, academics, people that are, what is your interpretation of sustainability? There isn't just one understanding, and maybe there shouldn't be. Maybe it should be diverse, and maybe we should look at this from different lenses, but then be careful that you don't try and impose your view on everybody. So I wanted to ask you, so how does a person get involved? If somebody's interested and they've listened to you talk about political ecology, how do you if you're interested in this, how do you operationalize it?
yeah.
So this might be like, oh, this is a tool I want to use. What do I do with it?
Yeah, depending on who you are and what you do, I think there are a lot of different ways. So if you're an academic, label your work as political ecology. I think I mentioned this earlier, that the analytical framework is actually fairly common. A lot of people will use elements of it. and either not realize that it is aligning with political ecology type of thinking, or just not call it a political ecology study. So if you're in academia, use the label so people can search for it. It's a pretty simple one. If you are some kind of practitioner, you work in development or with nonprofits or NGOs, I think it's really important to use the framework. That sounds very simple, but put the framework to use. It's a clever and very multi-dimensional methodology to deal with complexity, and often that is pretty sorely lacking. And community development and social and economic development projects that do interact with nature, which many of them do. So give a think as to how you might be able to use this methodology or borrow from this methodology to fill in gaps in what you're doing. And then, you know, as a person, I think the core takeaway from this is that power is absolutely the crux of environmental crisis and climate change issues, environmental issues. Power is really, really important. So again, just hopefully that sparks some interest and maybe opens a few doors for people to think about power in terms of their own communities, of who owns natural space. Do they have an agenda with it? Who is given access to that? Who's excluded? Think through all of those things, become fluent in your own environments, and try to chip away at these problems in any way you can. Again, vote for politicians with actually rigorous environmental agendas, support interesting companies doing good stuff, whether that's circular economy type thinking or something else. Yeah, just try to find a way to make a dent in that problem, understanding that it is a complex issue that affects many people in many different ways.
And when you talk about power, I mean, I think it also makes you think that, or what you could also be looking at is gender and age. I mean, I think gender is such a big thing, you know, in some societies, the role that men play, the role that women play, and, you know, your socioeconomic status. But what you are saying then to our audiences and people that are interested in it is look at this framework, consider it as a tool for investigating and solving problems, that you should look at issues from a, you know, a very with a more multidisciplinary lens. And quite interesting that you mentioned about NGOs, because in one of our, we on today, we'll also talk with Lawrence Leon, who is from Singapore, and he is working with a group of philanthropists, the Asia Philanthropy Society. And one of the things that he mentioned was that NGOs and these movements also need to, as much as they plug a gap in the, you know, in provision and solving problems, there is a need for looking at more systems-based solutions, and that by just trying to solve the immediate problem, you're never really going to find what the sources are, or really find a real true solution, because it could just be you know, a bucket that you keep with holes in, that you try to keep on filling, and that's how I see how even philanthropists could use the lens that you are looking at or looking through in solving these problems. Now, there are two more things, you know, as we come to the end of this interview. I'd really like to understand from you what can our audience, you know, who are in this conference, what can they do? How can they contribute to the cause of political ecology? I mean, is there some tips or some things that you would like to share that people can leave here and say, oh, I can do this, or this is an actionable step for me?
Yeah, I think again, it really comes down to, if you're not directly a researcher or practitioner in the field, I think the term can be a bit jargony. So moving beyond the the term itself, and if you're just a person who's interested in sustainability, going out and lecturing people about political ecology might not make you friends. However, I think the essence of it is so important to these wider environmental issues. So in terms of actionable tips, yeah, I think as you mentioned, there's definitely gaps and holes in the efficacy of NGOs and nonprofits. But the flip side of that is they are a very actionable pathway for people to start making change beyond being very civically motivated and active and voting and advocating and doing all of that stuff, which you absolutely should do. So I think an easy step beyond just using it as a kind of a mental framework to understand what's going on around you more. And exactly as you said, you had a great point talking about issues of gender inequality and race, socioeconomic status, class, caste, wherever you are, looking at the skews in ownership and allocation of natural resources is not only really interesting, but also very, I think, it really lifts a lid on a lot of the political instabilities in our different countries, in light of the Black Lives Matter movement in the US. What are the, can you look at that through an environmental lens? I would say absolutely. You look at, legacies of land ownership in the US, absolutely similar in South Africa right now, where you have so much contention over land tenure and transitions over land tenure and who holds wealth. I think a simple way to, well, not a quite a complex way to conceptualize, but a simple way to actualize the political ecology approach is to look at those kind of big issues of political instability and look at them through this lens and say, okay, well, if there have been these historic inequalities of access to and ownership over these, natural wealth generating assets, does it make sense that we're in the place that we're in right now? And how can we seek to redress that a little bit more equitably? And yeah, going beyond that, find organizations and people that are doing cool stuff and get involved. I think that's really the most simple, actionable way to do that, is find your sphere of influence and your leverage points for change and do it.
And think about, I think it's sometimes, I mean, for me, it's, and it brings me to what Stephen Covey was also saying, is working within your own sphere of influence. Find the big cause, find the thing that you really feel has meaning, because that helps to making you a happier person. But then it's no use that you just talk about it. You should think of small actionable things that you can do. And as you mentioned, it could be joining or supporting a meaningful NGO. It could be reading and learning more about it. It could be starting those conversations in your own community. It could be supporting a brand that that is, the kind of brand that will make a difference. So sometimes we feel so weak. Well, what can I do? How can I affect it? But we can all. If everybody just takes one small step, it could make a big difference. So that's really, really very useful what you've shared. And I'm quite interested to know what brought you to this, as we end off this interview. Would you mind sharing a little bit about your personal journey? What brought you to this field of study? And, just if you wouldn't mind sharing with the audience a little bit about your journey.
Sure. yeah, I think I got involved with political ecology far before I knew what it was, probably like many people. Um, I I did my undergrad degree in environmental management. Um, I was very interested in particularly wildlife conservation. So I did an undergrad in environmental management and then moved over into working in the tourism sector. I was interested in seeing how um, the tourism sector is such a big funder of conservation in Africa. I wanted to understand those linkages a little bit better, how tourism revenue contributes to environmental conservation. And I found, I think in that process, over the space of a few years, started to realize what a deeply human issue conservation is. And I started to realize also that tourism has the ability, I think, to really influence people and societies in a positive way, and that it can help to preserve cultures, it can help support livelihoods, but it also has a really dark underbelly. The impacts of tourism can also be quite insidious, I think, actually. So I became very interested in the connection point of those three, sort of environmentalism, livelihoods, education, skills training, and the tourism sector. And you spoke just now about the importance of finding your thing, like your niche that drives you.
Yeah.
I just became completely obsessed with inequality in protected areas like national parks, and how do those different agendas, of profit seeking in the tourism sector and the conservation agenda and human livelihoods, how do those things speak to one another? And ultimately, that became the focus of my work and my graduate studies and subsequent research. But ultimately, I think that the question that I'm out to try and answer at the end of the day is how can we promote social and economic equality in protected areas? And if there ever was a question for political ecology to answer, that's it.
That's it, right? Yes.
Yeah.
That is a big driver. But I think, if you find that passion in your life, if you find that thing and you know that your work can make a difference, I mean,
Yeah.
makes your life just so much more meaningful.
Absolutely.
So how did you're involved with Imagine Scholar? How does that fit into the whole journey of Caitlin? I mean, how did you get to that?
Yeah.
Can you maybe share as a parting information with our audience, what is Imagine Scholar?
Sure. So I'll share a little bit about how I got involved with the organization. As part of the story that I just shared, I made a little bit of a career swap a number of years ago to try and move out of the tourism industry and learn more about the effect of industry on people. So I was looking for some kind of organization that was either in or around a national park, and was just in that kind of geography, conservation fringe area geography, to learn about livelihoods issues, essentially. So I ended up quite randomly finding Imagine Scholar. We were a small education youth development nonprofit organization. We sit just about 20 minutes outside of one of Kruger National Park's southern borders. We're not involved in the tourism industry at all. We really focus on sort of progressive education, but I went and I wanted to learn about all of the things that I was interested in, and then it just completely opened a new door for me in my career of understanding the importance of education and this whole conversation. And I think I fundamentally believe that education, and it sounds a bit cliche, but education is an equalizer, and the community that we operate in is a very challenging geography for education, as you well know, being from South Africa. It's a rural area. School systems are really, really overburdened, under-resourced. Social services are lacking. There's a lot of issues, but at the same time, there's so much innovation and hunger to learn, and passion and excitement in students. So I think, as an organization, we differ a little bit from most education organizations that operate in those kind of stressed rural school districts. Instead of going for bolstering educational attainment metrics, matriculation rates, university admission rates, although we've been, I would say, very successful in achieving good statistics, we're much more focused on really fostering, I think, critical thinking skills, systems thinking skills, kind of fostering this culture of what we call playful excellence. And we say, just because you're a kid from a rural area of South Africa where the school district is bad, does not mean that you have to aspire to graduating high school. You can aspire to so much more. And so long as you have the tools, we're not out to teach students what to learn, we're out to teach students how to learn so that they can drive their own autonomous learning journeys in whatever way they choose to do that. I mean, we've had quite an impressive diversity of interests of students in our program. Yeah, we really try to drive that lifestyle and that notion of, you can be a pluralistic individual at the end of the day.
That's amazing. It really resonates with what and if our audience watched the session with Nadim Naktu and the Knowledge Society, and he actually brought on one of his students, Michael, who spoke exactly about what you were saying now. It's
Nice.
Why teachers teach us how to learn, excite us, let us drive our own education, and what the results are of this approach, like you've also seen, is absolutely phenomenal. You have 16-year-olds who are reinventing medical procedures, who are reinventing the way AI is used because they are interested, and they feel that they are in this journey of discovery, and they like what they're doing, and it's not about results or exams, which at the end of the day, I'm sorry, but in today's world, what does it mean? What does that matriculation certificate mean if you can't get a job? But if you invent things and you're innovative and you've got thinking skills, that's what I guess that's also why Reimagine Scholar has been winning awards, because of amazing program that you have. I wish we had another hour to talk, but this has been really fantastic, and I'm sure that the audience would want to connect with you in the app. Reach out to you, and please participate in the conversations in the EdSpace channel, because themes that have emerged from your talk is so relevant to the broader conversation of and the purpose of it. Really looking at about inclusion, at inclusion, looking at the importance of having empathy and compassion, because I think that is so important, that understanding these communities and localizing and involving them, and understanding their unique problems, and looking at leadership, because that leadership in this whole power dimension that you were talking about is also as important in the use of technology. So please do share some of your questions with Caitlin. Please get involved. Please reach out to her. She's, we will share links and more information, and read it in the conference book, where we will be giving you some more detail, because she's got such a wide base of knowledge. And Thank you so much. Can I ask you to leave the audience with one parting thought?
Yeah, I think more important than anything else, tying back into this being the theme of sustainability, I think you touched on this probably more eloquently than I will now earlier, but it's so important to just find that thing that drives you and that you're passionate about, and really identify those individual leverage points for change. I think, you know, it's so important for everyone to show up in some kind of way, but everyone can do that very differently. You don't have to show up in the same way that everyone else does. Look, take a critical look at your own life, your own interests, your own spheres of influence, and your own power, and yeah, find ways that are genuinely, authentically effective and aligned with your own morals, and go do those things. I'm a big believer that if everyone makes a tiny dent in these big issues, that something will will change.
It is a collective energy that comes from
It
it.
is, yeah.
And again, we hope that that's what the Inspired Conference is going to also do, is build a community for change and let people get together who wouldn't usually be able to connect because of sometimes the barriers of geographical barriers, or for many different reasons. So thank you so much, Vera. It was a great conversation, and I'm
Thank you for
sure that
having me.
everybody's going to be wondering and considering their own views on sustainability, their own perhaps use of this tool, and I'm sure that that's something you can advise people on who are interested to learn more about. So thank you so much for your time and for being part of our conference, Caitlin.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to connect with everyone on the app.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Cool.